The first disciples of Jesus did not attempt to build an image of their own. Their sole goal was to preserve the Master's words and keep the message they had received alive. That is why the Gospels hardly contain any data about their lives. Not even a description of Jesus himself is offered. The focus is on the teaching, not the protagonists. The destruction of Jerusalem and the first persecutions erased most of the memories. Only scattered fragments survived in the writings of Eusebius, Clement, and Irenaeus, who recorded the oldest traditions so that they would not be lost. Through those remnants, we can glimpse something of the men who carried the faith to distant regions of the empire, enduring dangers, hunger, exile, and death. They did not seek recognition, only to remain faithful. Their names remained as a testament to dedication and perseverance, pillars of a history that changed the course of the world. Who were in truth the 12 who carried Jesus' message to the ends of the known world? Peter, from fisherman to shepherd. Simon was born in Bethsaida, a small community located where the Jordan River flows into the Great Lake of Galilee. His family name was Simon, and his father's name was Juan, also known as Jonas in some variations. He would later sign his name as Simon bar Jonas. His mother is cited as Juana in certain traditions, although precise information is not preserved about her or about the total number of children, apart from Andres, his younger brother, who would also end up joining the apostolic group. As the area had a presence of non-Jewish population, Simon grew up speaking Aramaic and learned Greek from a young age. When he was around 6 years old, he was sent to the local school, as indicated by rabbinic teachings that prohibited living in a place without basic instruction. He received the elementary education imparted in the synagogue, focused on learning to read the scripture until approximately age 13, when young men were expected to take up trades. After finishing that training, Simon dedicated himself to fishing in the lake. At that time, there were numerous species, and fishermen used bronze or iron hooks, in addition to two main types of nets, the circular net thrown by hand and the enormous dragnet of about 1,500 feet long. Wide boats that could carry several people and were steered by a skipper were used to handle the equipment. The owners of these boats, organized into a kind of guild, commercialized the fish in important markets like that of Jerusalem. Already in his youth, Simon was married by decision of his family. Almost every marriage was agreed upon between close relatives. Some ancient writings mention that his wife would later be called Perpetua when they worked among Greek and Roman communities. There are no conclusive data on how many children they had, although texts such as the Acts of Peter mention a daughter named Petronilla, who would have been born after Jesus' resurrection and suffered an illness that left her paralyzed from the age of 10. An inscription found in Rome mentions a woman of that name who died in the year 98 AD, which coincides with that tradition. Around the year 28 AD, Simon lived in Capernaum with his wife, his mother-in-law, and his brother. He owned a boat with which he worked alongside Andres, and they maintained a working partnership with Zebedee, whose sons Santiago and Juan were close friends. The population considered the Galilean fishermen to be especially observant Jews, and Simon respected the dietary and ritual norms since childhood. Both he and Andres and the sons of Zebedee listened to John the Baptist, who baptized those who came to hear him in the Jordan. One day, Andres returned to Simon's house with enormous emotion and announced that they had found the Messiah. He immediately took him to where Jesus of Nazareth was. That encounter is situated in Betabara, an area of the Jordan Valley. When Jesus saw Simon, he told him that from then on he would be called Cephas, translated as Peter. The Aramaic term meant rock, and its Greek version, Petros, became the name by which he would be identified among the Greek-speaking communities. Simon returned to his usual work in Galilee. Sometime later, with John the Baptist already detained for openly criticizing Herod Antipas, he and Andres were cleaning their nets after a night with no results. The crowd approached to hear Jesus, and the teacher boarded Simon's boat to speak from there. Afterward, he asked him to row out to sea and cast the nets again. Although Simon knew from experience that it was not a good time to fish, he obeyed. The catch was so great that they needed help from the other boat. Upon seeing that, Simon fell before Jesus, saying that he was an unworthy man. Jesus replied that, from that moment, he would work to attract people instead of fish. Simon, Andres, Santiago, and Juan then left their economic activity to accompany Jesus. Shortly thereafter, Jesus went to the synagogue in Capernaum, where a man with an unclean spirit began to shout. Jesus healed him in front of everyone, causing a great impression. Then he went to the house where Simon and his family lived. Simon's mother-in-law had a high fever, and Jesus cured her. From that day on, Simon's house in Capernaum became a constant gathering place where people arrived with illnesses and others who sought help. On another occasion, while Jesus was speaking to the multitudes, 4 men carried a paralytic, and since they could not enter through the door, they climbed onto the roof and opened a section to lower him down. Jesus healed him right there. The family had to live with this permanent flow of people every time Jesus was in the city. At the moment when Jesus chose the 12, Simon was placed at the head of the group. During a visit to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked the disciples what people thought of him. Simon declared that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That episode included Jesus' announcement that the future community would have Simon as a reference with the keys of the kingdom. Simon accompanied Jesus to Mount Tabor along with Santiago and Juan. There he saw how Jesus' figure was transformed with an intense brightness while he conversed with Moses and Elijah. He was later present when Jesus walked on the lake and, at his request, advanced over the water until fear made him sink. During the Last Supper, Simon wanted to prevent Jesus from washing his feet, but ended up accepting when he understood the instruction. That night, Jesus announced that Simon would deny knowing him 3 times before dawn. After Jesus' arrest in Gethsemane, Simon tried to defend him using a sword with which he wounded the high priest's servant, but Jesus ordered the act to stop. Afterward, in the high priest's courtyard, Simon denied knowing Jesus 3 times, just as had been announced. Upon hearing the rooster, he left weeping deeply. After the resurrection, Jesus appeared to Simon. Then, by the lake, the scene took place in which Jesus asked him 3 times if he loved him, entrusting him to take care of his community. In that same conversation, he announced the kind of death he would have, in an expression that the disciples understood as a reference to crucifixion. Simon assumed the leadership of the group and became a central figure in the first chapters of Acts. He later traveled to Rome, where he faced persecution under Nero's rule. He was arrested along with his wife and remained in prison for several months, going through constant changes of guards, according to testimonies that narrate that many of them converted. Finally, around June 29th of the year 67 AD, Simon was executed by inverted crucifixion, a position he requested considering that he was not worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. With his death ended the earthly trajectory of the man who had been a fisherman of Galilee, an early disciple, a witness to the main episodes of Jesus' ministry, and a key figure in the first years of the movement that arose after the resurrection. Andrew, sour of encounters. Andres was born in Bethsaida, a village next to the Sea of Galilee, and from a young age he dedicated himself to fishing, just like his family. Although his home was in a quiet place, his spiritual search led him to John the Baptist, whom he followed before meeting Jesus. When John pointed to Jesus, saying that he was the Lamb of God, Andres heard him, followed him immediately, and spent the rest of the day with him. That same night, he went to tell Simon what he had discovered, affirming that he had found the Messiah. He was one of the first to join Jesus' mission. Although Pedro became more visible among the 12, Andres was always close, attentive, and ready to act when others doubted. On one occasion, it was he who noticed a child with some loaves and fish before the miracle of the multiplication. At another moment, he brought some Greeks who wanted to meet Jesus. He did not seek prominence but remained present, facilitating encounters and making possible what others overlooked. After the crucifixion and resurrection, Andres moved forward and ventured into other lands. Sources indicate that his apostolic journey took him through Asia Minor, Scythia, Thrace, and regions that today are part of Georgia and Ukraine. Some writings even place him in Byzantium, where it is said he organized a Christian community before the city became Constantinople. In Patras, a Greek city in the Peloponnese, his missionary activity brought him into conflict with the authorities. The proconsul Aegeus, angry at Andres' influence, had him arrested. Andres did not defend himself or ask for clemency. Instead of a quick execution, Aegeus ordered him to be crucified in a way different from that of Jesus, on a cross shaped like an X, known today as St. Andrew's Cross. According to tradition, the apostle was hung for 2 days, speaking non-stop to those who approached, encouraging people to follow Christ. Finally, he died without anyone being able to extract a word of complaint from him. His body was buried in Patras. Over time, Emperor Constantius II ordered the relics to be transferred to Constantinople as part of the effort to gather the remains of key figures of Christianity in the capital of the empire. They remained there for centuries, until the year 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, when the Crusaders sacked the city and took many relics to Western Europe. A part of Andres's remains arrived in Amalfi, Italy, where it is preserved in the cathedral that bears his name. In 1964, Pope Paul VI returned part of the Apostle's skull to Patras in a symbolic gesture of reconciliation between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. During the Middle Ages, the figure of Andres became a symbol of Christian unity, especially in the Greek world. Scotland adopted him as its patron saint, and his X-shaped cross was incorporated into the national flag. In Eastern Europe, legends about his passing and miracles attributed to his preaching are preserved. In Russia and Ukraine, it is considered that it was he who first brought the Christian message to those lands. The ancient accounts, although they mix facts with legendary elements, agree in pointing out his firm and silent character. He did not seek visible leadership or privileges. He was a constant link between Jesus and others from the first day. Iconography represents him with a diagonal cross and a book as a sign of his preaching. His feast is celebrated on November 30th. Although he never wrote a gospel, his legacy remained in the memory of the first Christian communities, which remembered him as the first to recognize the Messiah and as the one who gave his life quietly but constantly. His story did not end with his martyrdom. Throughout the centuries, churches, cathedrals, and entire countries have kept his memory alive. Every time an X-shaped cross is raised or his name is mentioned in the liturgical calendar, that fisherman who exchanged his nets for a mission without borders is remembered. Andres did not need grandiloquent words or theatrical gestures to mark history. He only walked, spoke, and remained. James, son of Zebedee, martyr of Jerusalem. Santiago the Elder, also called Jacob bar Zebedee, was probably born in Bethsaida, in the region of Galilee, where he grew up with his family dedicated to fishing. Some scholars suggested that he may have been the father of the apostle Judas Thaddeus, but it is more accepted that he was only a few years older than his brother Juan, and that both were born at the beginning of the Christian era. His father, Zebedee, was a fisherman and partner of Simon Pedro, and his mother, Salome, was the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. If that family relationship is correct, Santiago and Juan would have been cousins of the Lord. The Gospels mention several women present at the foot of the cross, and by comparing the accounts, it is understood that Salome, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, was also the sister of the Virgin. Mark names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and Jose and Salome. Matthew identifies the third woman as the mother of the sons of Zebedee, and John mentions the mother of Jesus, the wife of Cleopas and the sister of his mother. Everything indicates that it was the same person, which reinforces the idea of a direct family bond between Jesus and the sons of Zebedee. Santiago and his brother grew up in a working environment, learning their father's trade from a young age. Their father apparently had his own boats and a stable economic position. Some ancient writings affirm that Zebedee supplied fish to the priests of the temple, which would explain why Juan was known among the religious authorities and could enter the high priest's courtyard during Jesus' trial. It is also affirmed that both Zebedee and Salome followed the preaching of John the Baptist at some point and later supported Jesus' ministry with their own resources. An episode recorded by Matthew shows Salome approaching the teacher with an ambitious request that her sons occupy the highest places when he established his kingdom. She imagined a leader who would overthrow Rome and govern Israel. Jesus replied that they did not know what they were asking and asked them, "Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink?" Santiago and Juan affirmed that they could without understanding the suffering that awaited them. The teacher warned them that they would share his destiny, but that the places of honor did not depend on him. They would only understand that lesson with time. Santiago appears at 7 different moments in the New Testament. He was called to leave his nets along with Pedro, Andres, and Juan, and since then he was part of the circle closest to the teacher. Only Pedro, Juan, and he accompanied Jesus when he resurrected Jairus' daughter on the Mount of the Transfiguration and in the Garden of Gethsemane. It is not known whether that intimacy was due to kinship, their faith, or their decisive character, but their closeness to Christ was evident. Mark relates that, when choosing the 12, Jesus called Santiago and Juan Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. The reason is not explained, but a later episode seems to justify the nickname. Shortly before the Passion, upon passing through a Samaritan village where they were denied lodging, the rivalry between Jews and Samaritans ignited the anger of the two brothers, who asked permission to invoke fire from heaven and destroy the place. Jesus firmly reprimanded them, reminding them that their mission was not to destroy lives, but to save them. That scene revealed the energy and impulsiveness that characterized Santiago. Some later thinkers interpreted the nickname in a positive way. For the Jews, thunder could also allude to the voice of God, suggesting an inner strength to proclaim the truth. Probably both readings reflect different aspects of the apostle. Passion that needed guidance and energy that, once channeled, served to spread the message with conviction. In the primitive community, he was known as Santiago the Elder, to distinguish him from another younger apostle of the same name. The ancients described him as a robust man with an imposing presence, a thick beard, and a deep voice, someone who inspired respect just by entering. After the Ascension, Santiago was present at Pentecost, but then the texts do not mention him again until his death. Some medieval traditions affirmed that he travelled to Hispania to preach the gospel, and that there he had a vision of the Virgin Mary on a column of jasper, asking him to build a chapel. The sanctuary of Nuestra Señora del Pilar in Zaragoza arose from that legend. According to the same tradition, he would have returned to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. Although the story cannot be proven, the absence of references for a decade led some authors to think that he was outside Palestine for a good part of that time. Around the year 42, during the rule of Herod Agrippa, a persecution against the first Christians began. Santiago was arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin, accused of proclaiming that Jesus was the Son of God and the only way to salvation. Herod confirmed the sentence and ordered his beheading, a form of execution uncommon for non-Roman citizens, which is why some assume that Santiago had obtained Roman citizenship, perhaps through commercial ties of his family. According to an ancient account, the man who denounced him repented upon witnessing his serenity and publicly confessed his faith. Both were condemned together. On the way to the execution, the accuser asked for forgiveness, and Santiago embraced him and wished him peace. Afterward, the two were beheaded. With time, the belief arose that his remains were transferred to the northwestern region of Spain, where the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela was built, which would become a pilgrimage destination for thousands of faithful. Throughout the centuries, the apostle was considered the protector of the peninsula and a symbol of the faith that endured through wars and reconquests. Medieval legends even told that he appeared in battle to guide the Christians against the Muslim invaders, giving rise to the figure of Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer. John, the beloved disciple. Juan, son of Zebedee and Salome, was born in Galilee, in the fishing village of Bethsaida. Brother of Santiago the Elder, he worked from a young age with his father in the family fishing business. He knew Greek culture and language well, although he remained faithful to the Jewish tradition. Like Pedro and Andres, he was possibly a follower of John the Baptist before meeting Jesus. When Jesus called him, Juan was about 25 years old and never married. St. Augustine wrote that from his youth he maintained a life of singular purity. In the Gospels he appears alongside his brother and Pedro as part of the circle closest to the teacher. He was present at the resurrection of Jairus' daughter, at the Transfiguration, and in Gethsemane. He also helped prepare the Last Supper. Juan did not yet understand the spiritual purpose of Christ and was reprimanded for his ambition when he and his brother requested places of honor. His impetuous temperament motivated the nickname Sons of Thunder. Despite these rough edges, he was one of the most faithful disciples. On one occasion he wanted to punish those who did not receive them, but Jesus stopped him. On Calvary, he remained next to the cross and was entrusted with the care of the Virgin, a gesture that showed the absolute trust of the teacher. The Gospel of Juan refers to its author as the disciple whom Jesus loved, a humble way of not using his name. At the Last Supper, he leaned on Jesus' chest and received the sign of the traitor. He accompanied Pedro to the high priest's courtyard and witnessed his friend's denial. After the death of the teacher, he was one of the first to go to the tomb. He ran with Pedro and arrived first, although he waited before entering. He understood the resurrection upon seeing the empty linens. After Pentecost, he collaborated with Pedro in Jerusalem. Together they cured a crippled beggar, which led to their arrest and warning from the Sanhedrin. Even so, they continued their work. For years he remained in Jerusalem. He attended the council that decided not to impose Jewish law on Gentile converts. He later travelled to Rome, where according to Tertullian he was thrown into boiling oil without suffering harm. From there he was exiled to Ephesus to oversee the Christian communities of Asia. During Domitian's rule he was sent to Patmos, where he wrote the Apocalypse after a spiritual experience. Freed in the time of Nerva, he returned to Ephesus already elderly and organized the local churches. There he wrote his Gospel, offering a more theological and spiritual focus, and 3 letters in which he taught that loving one's neighbor and obeying Christ is proof of authentic faith. Ancient accounts narrate episodes from his final years, such as his journey to rescue a wayward young man, or his refusal to share a building with the heretic Cerinthus. In his old age he always repeated, "Little children, love one another," convinced that this commandment contained the whole law. He died in Ephesus around the year 100, at nearly 97 years old, after saying goodbye by blessing his disciples. His life remained as an example of faith, constancy, and balance between the firmness of thunder and the sweetness of love. Philip, bridge to the Gentiles. Felipe was born in Bethsaida, the same fishing village as Pedro, Andrés, Santiago, and Juan, and from a young age he worked in fishing. Some writings mention that he belonged to the tribe of Zabulon. His name, of Greek origin and common among Galilean Jews, spread especially after the Tetrarch Philip, son of Herod the Great, governed the regions near Galilee. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention him only as one of the 12, but the Gospel of John offers more detailed scenes. There it is recounted that Felipe had been a follower of John the Baptist, and that he met Jesus in Betabara. Shortly after, he brought his friend Nathanael to him, stating that they had found the man announced by Moses. In the multiplication of the loaves, Jesus put him to the test by asking him how to feed the multitude. Felipe responded with a practical calculation that showed the material difficulty, and it was Andrés who pointed out the boy with the loaves and fish. Later, when some Greeks sought to see Jesus, Felipe hesitated and asked Andrés for advice before taking them to the teacher, still showing uncertainty about the universal scope of the message. During the Last Supper, he asked Jesus to show them the Father, and he received a slight reprimand for not yet understanding the nature of the teacher. His attitude, however, revealed a sincere desire for clarity. After the resurrection, he remained in Jerusalem. Many ancient authors identified the apostle with the Felipe named among the 7 deacons in Acts, which would imply a double service, preaching and community attention. After the martyrdom of Esteban, he left Jerusalem and preached in Samaria. There many sick people were healed and the city experienced great joy. The superficial conversion of Simon Magus is also related, whose attempt to buy spiritual power was reprimanded by Pedro when he and Juan arrived to support the community. Then Felipe was sent south towards Gaza. On the way he found the carriage of an Ethiopian official reading the prophet Isaiah. The man invited him to come up. Felipe explained the passage to him and baptized him in a nearby stream. After this, the text affirms that the Spirit of the Lord snatched Felipe away, and he appeared in Azotus. From there he preached to Caesarea, where he resided for more than 20 years, and had 4 virgin daughters with the gift of prophecy. He later settled in Hierapolis, in Asia Minor. Writers like Polycrates and Gaius confirmed that his remains and those of 2 of his daughters rested there. From that city, he supervised the Christian communities of Phrygia. Later texts relate his confrontation with pagan practices and some miracles associated with his preaching. He also made missionary trips through Asia Minor and North Africa. He preached in Carthage and baptized many Gentiles and Jews before returning to Hierapolis. His daughters continued his work in different cities. Felipe died there around the year 90 during the persecutions of Domitian, crucified upside down like Pedro. His memory remained as that of a man who carried Jesus' message beyond the borders of Israel, recognized as the first evangelist of the Gentiles. Bartholomew, the sincere Israelite. The name of Bartolome became known in part due to an event that occurred many centuries later, the massacre on the day of his feast in 1572, when thousands of Protestants were assassinated in France. In the painting The Last Judgment by Michelangelo, his figure also appears, bald, strong, and with his face marked by indignation, holding the knife of his martyrdom in one hand and his torn-off skin in the other. However, beyond those late images, few remember who this apostle really was. Since the 9th century, Bartolome has been identified with Nathanael, whom the Gospel of Juan mentions by name. Matthew, Mark and Luke always cite Bartolome next to Felipe, and in Juan it is Felipe who introduces Nathanael to Jesus. That coincidence led several authors to conclude that it was the same person. The name Bartolome, son of Tolmai, was a patronymic, while Nathanael, God has given, was a personal name. If so, the disciple called in Cana would be the same apostle mentioned in the other Gospels. The Gospel of Juan narrates that, shortly after Jesus' baptism, Felipe went to look for Nathanael and announced that they had found the Messiah. Nathanael, a devout Jew, reacted with skepticism upon hearing that Jesus came from Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Even so, he accompanied him. Upon seeing him approach, Jesus said, "This is a true Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked how he knew him, and Jesus replied that he had seen him under the fig tree before Felipe called him. Then Nathanael recognized him as the Son of God and King of Israel. Jesus added that he would see greater things, comparing himself to Jacob's dream ladder as a link between heaven and earth. That was Nathanael's main scene in the Gospel. Later, Juan mentions him among the disciples who were fishing when the resurrected Jesus appeared on the shore. The synoptics offer no further details, but they include him in the list of the 12. Some ancient authors tried to relate him to the house of David by the name Tolmai, but there is no firm evidence. Like the other apostles, he was a simple man, probably a fisherman. Regarding his later work, writers like Jerome and John Chrysostom affirmed that he first preached in Lycaonia, a mountainous and poor region in Central Asia Minor, where Pablo and Bernabe had also worked. There he founded communities and ordained local leaders. Later he moved northeast to Armenia, where other apostles also preached. It was later shown that his martyrdom did not occur there, but much further east. Tradition holds that Bartolome collaborated for a time with Felipe in Hierapolis, in Phrygia, around the years 58 or 59. Shortly after, he undertook his longest journey toward the Indian subcontinent. According to Eusebius and Jerome, the scholar Panteno traveled to India in the year 180 and found a Christian community that preserved a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew, supposedly brought by Bartolome more than a century earlier. The text known as the Acts of Abdias describes him as a man of medium height, fair complexion, curly hair, and a thick beard. It was said that he had a powerful voice, wore the same clothes for decades, and prayed continuously. Although exaggerated, these descriptions reflect his austerity, joy, and ability to learn languages. While preaching in Kalyana, on the west coast of India, Bartolome was requested by King Polemio to heal his daughter, who suffered from a mental disorder. The apostle asked for her to be released and cured her. Grateful, the king allowed him to teach freely. In that region, the inhabitants venerated a goddess called Astaroth. Bartolome gathered the crowd before the statue and ordered her to manifest herself. According to tradition, the image broke, and a demon came out chained by an angel. The king, his family, and many inhabitants accepted baptism. The monarch's brother, Astyages, did not approve of the conversion. He launched an offensive against the new believers and captured the apostle. Bartolome was beaten, flayed alive, and finally beheaded. His death occurred on August 24th of the year 62, when he was about 58 years old. Since then, he has been represented with a knife and his own skin as a symbol of his martyrdom. In the 20th century, the Indian researcher A.C. Perumalil studied the ancient sources and argued that the account contained real elements. He analyzed coins and inscriptions and concluded that Bartolome preached in Kalyana, known by the Romans as India Felix, a commercial enclave linked to the Roman, Arab, and Iranian empires. He identified King Polemio with a governor named Pulumai and Astyages with King Aristokarman. The goddess Astaroth would correspond to Astamurti, a local fertility divinity. According to that reconstruction, Bartolome would have traveled from Armenia to a port on the Persian Gulf and sailed to Kalyana, carrying with him a Hebrew copy of the Gospel of Matthew. There he founded a Christian community that survived several centuries under the Patriarchate of Babylon. The apostle, recognized for his simplicity and frankness, left as a legacy the expansion of the faith to regions never before reached by the disciples. His death marked the beginning of a tradition that kept alive the memory of that Israelite without deceit who saw God and followed him until the end. Thomas, Apostle of the East. Thomas is remembered above all for the nickname that marked him, the Doubter. For centuries he has been imagined as a serious and suspicious man, but the New Testament accounts offer a different image, that of someone rational, brave and loyal. He was mentioned few times, but each scene reveals a determined follower with a clear mind and a firm spirit. Of all the disciples, only Pedro and Juan have a more extensive later history known than his. Almost all his work was developed far from the Roman Empire, and most of the records come from Eastern traditions. Before his missions in Osroene, Armenia, Iran, India and Southeast Asia, the Gospels offer some glimpses into his character. The three synoptics name him among the 12, but it is Juan who describes 4 essential moments of his life. The first occurred when Jesus decided to return to Bethany, where his friend Lazarus lived, despite the danger of returning to Judea. After being expelled from Jerusalem for claiming that he and the Father were one, returning meant certain condemnation. When Jesus announced his intention, Thomas replied, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." His phrase did not show pessimism, but realism and courage. He understood the risk and was willing to face it. The second scene took place during the Last Supper. Jesus spoke of the way to the Father, and Thomas intervened, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" His question gave rise to the statement, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." That intervention again revealed his direct character and his need for clarity. The most remembered episode occurred after the resurrection. Jesus appeared to the disciples, and Thomas was not present. When they told him what had happened, he replied that he would not believe until he touched the wounds. It was not gratuitous incredulity, but a demand for concrete proof. He had seen the teacher die and knew that no one returns from the dead. When Jesus presented himself again and allowed him to touch the wounds, Thomas exclaimed, "My Lord and my God!" Jesus replied, "Blessed are those who believe without having seen," a phrase directed at those who would believe through the apostolic testimony. Thomas appears one last time in the Gospel of Juan, along with other disciples on a fishing trip on the Sea of Galilee. His name, translated as Didymus, means twin and was more of a nickname. Ancient Syriac writings and Eusebius mention that his birth name was Judas or Judah. The Book of the Acts of Thomas, written around the year 200, describes him as a carpenter and relative of Jesus, coming from a different background than the fishermen of Galilee. After the ascension, his work was intense. According to Eusebius, shortly after Pentecost, he evangelized the region of Osroene, a territory located between the Roman and Iranian empires. In the archives of Edessa, there were documents that recounted the conversion of Prince Abgar the Black, sick and without medical remedy. He would have written to Jesus asking for healing. The oral response indicated that Jesus had to fulfill his mission, but would send one of his disciples. According to tradition, Thomas convinced Judas Thaddeus to go to Edessa, and both preached there and in Armenia, founding communities that would later form the Church of the East. Later, Thomas moved east. Ancient Syriac texts narrate his arrival in India. The Acts of Thomas combine history and symbolism, but preserve consistent details. Writers like Hippolytus and Eusebius mention his work in Parthia, the name by which the Romans designated Iran. When the Portuguese arrived in southern India in the 16th century, they found a Christian community that attributed its origin to the Apostle. Syriac documents and ancient hymns confirmed the antiquity of that tradition. Some researchers affirm that Christianity arrived in India in the 4th century. Others maintain older roots. A Syriac text from the 3rd century, The Doctrines of the Apostles, states that India and all its regions received the priesthood from the hands of Judas Thomas. No other region claims his martyrdom. Before reaching the subcontinent, Thomas preached at the court of a king named Gundaforo, in the region that today corresponds to northern Pakistan. For centuries his existence was doubted, until coins from the 1st century with his name engraved in Greek were found. According to the accounts, Thomas was invited to build a palace, but he distributed the money among the poor. When the king questioned him, he affirmed that the work could only be seen in the afterlife. The situation changed when the monarch's brother, after a near-death experience, claimed to have seen in heaven that palace built with the apostles' charity. Around the year 52 AD, Thomas left the north due to invasions and headed to southern India. The country was divided into kingdoms that actively traded with Rome. Local traditions say that he disembarked in Cranganore, a port city where Greeks, Romans, Jews and Arabs coexisted. There he began his preaching and became linked with the Jewish communities of the place. Numerous accounts preserve episodes of his mission: the healing of a minister who had lost his hand, the release of a young man unjustly accused, and the symbolic resurrection of a child murdered by his father to incriminate him. Between the years 52 and 69, according to the Song of Rabban, Thomas founded 7 churches, baptized thousands of people, healed the sick, and ordained priests and bishops. His most solid community was established in Cranganore. He lived with austerity, ate bread and water, and dedicated long periods to prayer. The temples he founded were decorated only with crosses. In his final years he settled in Mylapore. Local chronicles say that Brahmin priests, fearing the expansion of Christianity, conspired against him. One afternoon, while praying in a cave, he was attacked with a spear. Seriously wounded, he reached a small chapel, where he clung to a stone cross and uttered his last words, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." It was July 3rd of the year 72. His death sealed a life completely devoted to faith and left a deep mark on the confines of the known world. Matthew, the chronicler of the kingdom. The name of Matteo appears among the 12 as one of the best known, especially for the gospel that bears his signature, considered for centuries the most read and quoted of the 4. However, behind that fame is hidden a figure about whom little is known for certain. Even the text attributed to him seems to have undergone several modifications over time. For that reason, many call him the Phantom Apostle, a man known for his work, but whose personal history has almost been lost. The Gospels briefly narrate his calling. Jesus saw a tax collector sitting at his post and said to him, "Follow me." That man, called Matteo in the Gospel that bears his own name, appears as Levi in Mark and Luke. Tradition identifies them as the same person. Levi was his Hebrew name, common in Judea, and Matteo, gift of God, his Greek name, used in official contexts. According to Mark, Levi was the son of Alphaeo, which would make him the brother of Santiago the Younger and Simeon, and a relative of Jesus through family ties. He was working in Capernaum when he was called, probably after having previously known the teacher. His occupation was despised. The Roman collection system operated through concessions to contractors who collected taxes with their own employees. Matteo was not a chief publican, but a subordinate with a certain rank in the tax office of Capernaum, where port fees, tolls, and commercial duties were collected. His position allowed him to receive numerous guests at his house. After his calling, he offered a banquet for Jesus, which provoked criticism from religious authorities for sharing a table with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus replied, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." After the calling, the Gospels hardly mention him again. His later importance derives from the Gospel attributed to him. Papias, at the beginning of the 2nd century, affirmed that Matteo gathered the sayings of Jesus in the Aramaic language, and that each person translated them as best they could. Irenaeus maintained that he wrote a Gospel directed at the Hebrews while Pedro and Pablo were preaching in Rome. Tertullian and Origen recognized him as the author, and Eusebius mentioned that Panteno found a copy of his text in India around the year 180. Jerome, in 392, offered the most detailed testimony. Matteo would have composed his work in Hebrew or Aramaic for the Jewish believers, and it was later translated into Greek by an unknown author. He claimed to have seen the original manuscript in the library of Caesarea and to have consulted it with the Nazarenes of Beroea. He pointed out that Matteo directly quoted the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, without following the Greek version of the Septuagint. Everything indicates that the original Gospel was written between the years 50 and 70, in Jerusalem or its surroundings. Over time, someone adapted it and rendered it into Greek, and that version is the one that has endured. His Gospel emphatically emphasizes the fulfillment of Hebrew prophecies. On 13 occasions he repeats the formula, so that what was said by the prophet might be fulfilled, showing that the life of Jesus was understood as a continuation of the ancient promises. Subsequent studies indicated that the text functioned as a bridge between the Scriptures and the new Christian faith, giving Jewish converts assurance that the message of Christ did not break with their heritage, but completed it. Even so, some authors observed that several quotes from the Old Testament come from the Greek version, which suggests that the text we possess today is not a simple translation of the Aramaic original. Probably a later editor combined part of Matteo's material with the Gospel of Mark to produce the definitive form towards the end of the 1st century. Little is known about his personal life and missionary activity. Clement of Alexandria described him as an austere man, a vegetarian who ate fruits and vegetables. According to Clement, he served the Judeo-Christian community in Palestine for 15 years. Irenaeus and Jerome agreed that his ministry was directed mainly to converts from Judaism. Other traditions place him evangelizing in Persia, Macedonia, Egypt, Syria, and Ethiopia. The majority maintains that he died a martyr under Domitian, although the versions differ on the location. Clement, on the other hand, affirmed that he died naturally at an advanced age. If the data of the 15 years in Judea is accepted, his initial work would have ended around the year 47. He does not appear among the prominent leaders of Jerusalem when Pablo mentions Santiago, Pedro, and Juan as the pillars of the church, nor is any activity of his recorded in Acts, except his name in the list of the 12. It is possible that he later traveled through the Jewish colonies of the Near East or toward Egypt, where there were communities linked with Ethiopia. In the 1st century, Ethiopia, or Aksum, was a prosperous kingdom with constant trade with Rome. Numerous Jewish communities lived there, which made an apostolic mission plausible. Ethiopian legends about Matteo were preserved in later texts. One of them, gathered in the apostolic history of Abdias, narrates that he arrived at a city called Nadaver, invited by the minister converted by Felipe. In that tradition, Matteo confronts 2 magicians who dominated King Agrippa. After several wonders, he resurrected the monarch's son and founded a church called the Resurrection. He remained there for 23 years, ordained priests, founded communities, and baptized the royal family. Finally, according to that version, he was assassinated by order of Hirtaio, the king's successor, when he refused to convince a princess named Iphigenia, consecrated to God, to marry him. Another later account, the martyrdom of Matteo, offers a different version, placing him among peoples called cannibals. After exorcising several possessed people and achieving numerous conversions, the local chief ordered him to be crucified and burned alive. The fire took the symbolic form of a serpent and pursued the chief, who asked for forgiveness. Matteo, still alive, ordered the flames to be extinguished before dying. It was said that his body was found intact. Although these narratives are symbolic, they could preserve a real core, that Matteo preached among Jewish communities in Ethiopia for decades and died in eastern lands, perhaps in Persia, as Hippolyto maintains, in a city called Hieres, around the year 90. His figure remained shrouded in mystery. If his gospel reflects his character, he was a methodical man, dedicated to linking the Jewish roots with the new faith. But the data about his end are scarce and scattered. For this reason, among all the disciples, Matteo continues to be the most difficult to grasp, the true invisible apostle. Santiago, son of Alphaeo, the silent servant. Among the followers of Jesus, there were 3 men named Santiago, but only one was known as the younger, son of Alphaeo, and a woman named Mary. His name appears in the lists of the 12, although the New Testament offers few details. His history is intertwined with that of an extended family where Matteo, Joses, and Simeon also appear, identified as children of the same couple. Some ancient writers mention that this Alphaeo, also called Cleopas, was the brother of Jose, Mary's husband, which would make this Santiago a cousin of Jesus. The Gospels mention his mother among the women who were near the cross. Matthew and Mark present her as Mary, the mother of Santiago the younger and of Joses, while Juan calls her Mary, the wife of Cleopas. That variation is explained because Alphaeo and Cleopas correspond to the same Hebrew name, Halphai. The Bible does not indicate when he was called, although it is probable that, like his brother Matteo, he lived in Capernaum and knew Jesus' teachings. Some maintain that he also worked in the field of taxes, although there is no confirmation. He is distinguished from Santiago the Elder by his stature and by the discreet role he played within the group. His nickname, the Younger, alluded only to a physical difference or age. Throughout tradition, his figure appears almost always in silence, without speeches or prominent scenes, but with a constant presence in the primitive community. His brother Simeon would later be Bishop of Jerusalem and moved the seat of the believers to the city of Pella before the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, ensuring the survival of the Christians of Jewish origin. That family context shows that Santiago belonged to a lineage that exercised prolonged influence. The data about him comes from ecclesiastical historians. After Christ's ascension, he would have remained in Jerusalem along with other relatives of the Lord. Some ancient sources present him as the first bishop of Syria, perhaps in Antioch, but that affirmation contradicts writings from the 2nd century that attribute that title to Euodio, designated by Pedro. The most coherent versions indicate that Santiago the Younger remained in Jerusalem, where he died at the hands of a mob of Jewish fanatics around the year 62. His death would have occurred in the same period in which his relative Santiago the Just, leader of the Church of Jerusalem, also perished, with whom he shared an environment and tensions with the local religious authorities. Some accounts show him as a pious man, faithful to the traditions of Israel and committed to Jesus' teachings, but without the public exposure of the most prominent leaders. Nothing indicates that he traveled outside Palestine or founded communities abroad. His name is not associated with miracles, gospels, or letters. He was a reserved disciple, a witness who continued serving in his local environment when many companions left to preach in other regions. Among the anonymous believers, he gained fame as a symbol of those who uphold the faith without seeking recognition. The traditions about his remains are divergent. Some Eastern writers affirmed that his bones rested in Jerusalem alongside those of his brother Simeon. Others placed them in Antioch, but no version can be verified. In Acts, he only appears in the list of the 12. Despite the scarcity of data, his memory was maintained especially among Christians of Jewish origin who saw him as an example of discreet fidelity. Santiago, son of Alphaeo, was part of the group that witnessed Pentecost, where the Christian movement was consolidated. Since then, he worked among the faithful in Jerusalem, participating in the organization of the community that shared goods, prayers, and teachings. His life unfolded in a hostile political context marked by the Roman occupation and the conflicts between Jews and Christians. He remained in the Holy City when other apostles dispersed, which reveals his commitment to the original root of the faith. According to later traditions, he died stoned by the same leaders who had condemned Stephen. It is related that his last words were a prayer asking for forgiveness for his attackers, reflecting the spirit that Jesus showed on the cross. Although little was preserved about him, his figure remained associated with silent service. While other apostles became public figures or authors of texts, Santiago the Younger was remembered for his constancy, his loyalty, and his willingness to remain at the heart of the community without seeking prominence. In the East, he is venerated as one of the hidden pillars of early Christianity, and in the West, he is celebrated together with Saint Felipe. His life summarizes the experience of those who sustained the movement from its roots, simple men who kept the faith alive in the midst of silence. Thaddeus, Light of Edessa. Judas Thaddeus, also called Lebbaeus, was one of the disciples least mentioned in the Gospels, although his name appears with different forms depending on the evangelist. Some texts record him as Thaddeus, others as Lebbaeus, and Luke names him as Judas, son of Santiago. One distinguishes him as Judas, not Iscariot, to avoid confusion with the traitor. The three names belong to the same man. Judas was a common Hebrew name, while Thaddeus and Lebbaeus seem to be Semitic nicknames whose probable meaning is brave or good-hearted. The expression Judas of Santiago can mean both son and brother of a man named Santiago. It is not clear whether it was the younger or another relative, although tradition places him within the family or close circle of Jesus. The scriptures only mention him in the list of the 12, but a tradition cited by Eusebius affirms that, before being an apostle, he was one of the 70 disciples sent by Jesus to announce the kingdom, which would explain his rapid missionary departure after the resurrection. In the Gospels, he only speaks once. During the Last Supper, he asked Jesus, "Lord, why are you going to manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" It was a doubt arising from not yet understanding the spiritual dimension of the mission. Jesus replied that whoever truly loved could understand his word. After that moment, Thaddeus disappears from the biblical account. His figure reappears in the ancient traditions relating to Edessa, a city located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, governed by King Abgar V. According to an account preserved by Eusebius, the monarch, seriously ill, wrote to Jesus asking for healing. Jesus, close to his passion, would have replied that he could not go, but that after his ascension he would send one of his disciples. That envoy was Judas Thaddeus. After the resurrection, he traveled to Edessa and stayed at the house of Tobias, a local Jew. There he began to preach among the Hebrew community, and the news of his healings soon spread. Abgar called him into his presence, and Thaddeus laid his hands upon him, resulting in his immediate healing. The king, moved, listened to the apostle's announcement of the death and resurrection of Christ and allowed him to preach freely in his territory. When he tried to offer him riches as thanks, Thaddeus rejected them, claiming that whoever had left his own should not accept that of others. That gesture was remembered in the region as a symbol of independence from political power. The success of his preaching transformed Edessa into one of the first firmly established Christian communities in the east. From there he travelled north, venturing into Armenia. That kingdom, a border between Rome and Persia, lived in constant tension. Thaddeus established another community there and remained for several years, collaborating with local disciples. Later, Armenian sources mention him as their first evangelizer, long before St. Gregory the Illuminator officially converted the country in the 4th century. In Armenia, he would have coincided with Simon the Zealot. Local traditions related that both continued together toward eastern territories. In those regions, Thaddeus was remembered as the Apostle of the Faithful Heart, associated with the founding of the first temples and the conversion of entire families. Over time, popular devotion turned him into the patron saint of difficult causes. The origin of this title is related to the memory of the miracle of Edessa and his work among the sick and exiles, where he healed and assisted those who seemed to have no solution. It is not known with certainty how he died. Some traditions affirm that he was martyred in Persia along with Simon, others suggest that he reached an advanced age. Due to the constant union of their names in later accounts, they share the same liturgical date. What is certain is that his memory remained as that of an envoy who carried the message to remote regions without seeking recognition. Judas Thaddeus was one of the men who spoke least in the sacred texts, but whose mark expanded through entire territories. In silence, he planted churches in Edessa and Armenia, healed the sick, announced the resurrection, and embodied the fidelity of those who carried the word beyond the borders of the Roman world. Simon the Zealot, Path of Fire. Simon was one of the least mentioned apostles in the Gospels, but his nickname distinguishes him, the Zealot or the Cananean. The evangelists Matthew and Mark called him Cananios, while Luke, both in his Gospel and in Acts, used the term zelotes directly. Both words come from the Aramaic kananaia, which can be translated as jealous or enthusiastic. This title generated various theories. Some thought it came from Cana of Galilee, others related him to the Zealot movement, a nationalist group opposed to Roman rule. It is not known if he really belonged to that organization, but many identified him as a former patriot whose zeal, after knowing Jesus, was transformed into spiritual fervor. Little is known about his previous life. The scriptures only confirm that he was one of the 12, but later writings describe him as a determined man, capable of directing his natural enthusiasm toward the expansion of the gospel. Various authors attempted to reconstruct his itinerary. St. Basil the Great wrote that Simon died peacefully in Edessa, while other traditions maintain that he was martyred in Persia. Bishop Doroteo of Tyre affirmed that he preached in Mauritania, then in Africa, and finally in Britain. According to other sources, he traveled through Egypt, Libya, and North Africa before embarking toward the Atlantic. The coincidence among ancient chroniclers suggests that he truly crossed a good part of these regions. In Britain, recently converted into a Roman province, he would have preached briefly until the rebellions led by Queen Boadicea broke out. The instability forced many foreigners to flee, and it is believed that Simon then returned to the Mediterranean East. Shortly after, around the year 66, he met Judas Thaddeus again. Together they undertook a mission to Persia, a territory governed by Vologases I, where Zoroastrianism predominated. Despite the hostility toward foreign teachings, they began to preach in the region of Babylon, on the banks of the Euphrates, and achieved numerous conversions. Their activity provoked the opposition of the local priests. Among them were 2 magicians named Zaroes and Arphaxad, who persuaded the authorities to detain the missionaries. Simon and Thaddeus were taken to the main temple and were demanded to offer incense to the idols. When they refused, the stone figures fell to the ground, unleashing the fury of the crowd. Simon looked at his companion, and according to tradition said to him, "I see that the Lord is calling us." At that moment the stoning began. Thaddeus was pierced by a spear, and Simon, captured by several men, was quartered with a saw. Thus ended the lives of 2 discreet but firm disciples. Their joint martyrdom was remembered as an example of absolute fidelity. The churches of East and West have honoured them on the same day ever since, October 28th, with Simon the Zealot, a trajectory that united the political passion of an ancient patriot with the fervour of a tireless preacher closes. His history converges with that of Thaddeus on his last journey, and both represent the expansion of Christianity toward the confines of the Persian Empire. Through them, the faith crossed regions that not even the Roman legions had reached. Their names, barely mentioned in the Gospels, remained united in the memory of the Church as a testament to two different paths that converged in the same destiny. Judas Iscariot, shadow of treachery. Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, was the disciple who caused the most confusion among those who knew Jesus. His surname, Iscariot, probably referred to the town of Keriot in Judea, which would make him the only non-Galilean Jew in the apostolic group. Others consider that it derives from the term used for the Sicarii, the dagger-bearers. In any case, Judas was a man of different origin and complex character. Nothing is known about his previous life, but the Gospels agree that he was appointed treasurer of the group, responsible for guarding the arms. The Gospel of Juan points out that he took advantage of that position to keep part of the money. Even so, Jesus kept him among his own and treated him with the same trust as the others. For centuries, different explanations for his betrayal have been proposed. Some imagine him frustrated at seeing that Jesus would not lead a political revolution. Others maintain that he sought to force a miraculous gesture before the authorities. There are also those who think that his main motivation was greed. No theory has been confirmed. The betrayal began in the days before Passover. After Jesus' anointing in Bethany, Judas protested, alleging that the perfume should have been sold to help the poor, although the evangelist affirms that he sought to control the funds. Shortly after, his resentment became evident. At the Last Supper, Jesus announced that one of those present would betray him. Each disciple asked if it would be him. Judas did the same. Jesus replied to him in a low voice, "You have said it." Then he took a piece of bread, dipped it, and gave it to him. At that instant, according to Juan, Satan entered into him. Jesus added, "What you are about to do quickly." And Judas left. It was night. He then presented himself before the high priests and agreed to deliver the teacher for 30 pieces of silver, the usual price of a slave. That amount shows that money was not the main motivation. In Gethsemane, he arrived accompanied by guards and priests. He had agreed upon a signal. "The one I kiss, that is he." He approached, greeted Jesus, and kissed him. The teacher said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" After the arrest, the Gospels offer different accounts of his end. Matthew affirms that upon seeing that Jesus was condemned, Judas felt remorse, returned the money, and confessed to having delivered innocent blood. He threw the coins in the temple and hanged himself. With that money, the priests bought a field called Field of Blood. The Book of Acts relates instead that he himself acquired that land and died there, falling and bursting his body open against the ground. Both versions agree on a tragic end and a cursed place associated with his name. Over time, poets and thinkers tried to understand his destiny. Longfellow, in his poem Aceldama, presented him as a tormented man who never managed to love or feel loved, marked by a force that dominated him. Other authors were more severe. Dante placed him in the deepest circle of hell, eternally devoured by Satan, a symbol of absolute betrayal. Recent interpretations insist that Judas was fully conscious of his choice. Jesus, even knowing what would happen, chose him and allowed him to exercise his freedom until the end. Juan summarizes it with a blunt phrase, "One of you is a devil." Some church fathers added legendary accounts about his death. Papias wrote that his body swelled monstrously and ended up exploding. Apollinar affirmed that he survived a failed hanging and died later, disfigured by disease. These narratives reflect the repulsion that his name inspired for centuries. In Christian tradition, Judas embodies betrayal and the warning about guilt without faith. He felt remorse, but sought comfort from those who had corrupted him, and not from Jesus. Thus ended his life, isolated from the rest of the apostles, and turned into an example of how ambition, resentment, and impatience can destroy the one who nourishes them. Judas knew the teacher closely, but chose the opposite path. Matthias, the ordered substitute. After Judas's death, The 11 disciples understood that the group should be complete again. Pedro gathered the others in Jerusalem and reminded them that it was necessary to designate someone who had accompanied Jesus from Juan's baptism until the Ascension. 2 names emerged: José, called Barsabas, also known as Justo, and Matthias. Both had followed the teacher from the beginning. The community prayed, "Lord, you know the hearts of all. Show us which of these 2 you have chosen to occupy the ministry that Judas abandoned." Then they cast lots, a common practice in Israel to discern important decisions, and the lot fell upon Matthias, who officially joined the group of apostles. Nothing more is said about him in the Bible, but some ancient authors added details. Eusebius affirmed that he had been one of the 70 disciples sent by Jesus before his crucifixion. Clement of Alexandria even identified him with Zacchaeus, the tax collector transformed after receiving the teacher in Jericho, although that identification was never confirmed. Clement also transmitted teachings attributed to Matthias. He said that he instructed his disciples to dominate the body and despise its appetites, insisting on the renunciation of pleasures as a path toward the purity of the soul. That ascetic line linked him to the tradition of John the Baptist, focused on discipline, moderation, and constant faith. His influence reached figures like the deacon Nicholas, who adopted chastity following his principles. Various traditions locate his missionary activity in Armenia and in regions of the Black Sea, where he would have accompanied Andres. Some accounts relate him to the evangelization of nomadic peoples in the north, known for their ferocity. He spent years teaching small groups of converts before returning to Jerusalem. There are different versions about his death. An ancient chronicle affirms that he was stoned for altering Jewish customs. Others place him crucified in Kolchis, in modern-day Georgia. The most accepted is that he died in Jerusalem around the year 51, probably becoming one of the first apostles martyred after the Ascension. The Church remembered him for his austerity and discretion. While other apostles were associated with heroic journeys or extraordinary miracles, Matthias became a symbol of silent fidelity. His feast day is celebrated on May 14th, the day on which his election is commemorated as an example of humility and perseverance. Some later writers debated whether Pedro acted too quickly in choosing a replacement for Judas, because years later, Pablo would present himself as apostle by the will of God. However, Pablo did not meet the established conditions. He had not accompanied the teacher from the beginning. For that reason, the place legitimately belonged to Matthias. His central message was the renunciation of desire and inner domination. He taught that faith should nourish the spirit and that the flesh should be kept subject. That doctrine influenced the first groups that practiced fasting and community life. Unlike Judas, whose history ended in despair, that of Matthias represented the re-establishment of order among the apostles. His election symbolized the continuity of the mission entrusted by Jesus to the original group. His name remained associated with duty fulfilled, silent service, and the firmness of the believer who did not seek recognition, but to restore the unity of the circle that had remained incomplete. Over time, the voices of the apostles faded, but their message continued to spread to every corner of the world. Those men, simple and distinct from each other, sustained the foundation of a faith that survived persecutions, empires, and centuries of distance. They were neither scholars nor politicians. They were witnesses who spoke of what they had seen. Their unity was not born of force, but of the shared conviction of having known the same teacher. Through them, Christianity went from being a small group in Jerusalem to a universal current. Each name, from Pedro to Matthias, remained united to a mission that did not stop. Their legacy was to fulfill the promise, to carry Jesus' teaching to the ends of the earth.